It was just another ordinary flight for the crew, or so they thought. The busy hum of the plane's engines filled the air as the passengers settled into their seats, buckling their seat belts and adjusting their tray tables. Everyone was preparing for a typical flight, unaware that things were about to take a surprising turn. Among the crew was a young flight attendant named Sarah. She was new to the job, still learning the ropes, and trying to find her way in the big world of aviation. She wasn't the loudest or the most outgoing. In fact, she often blended in with the background, quietly making her way through the cabin. Sarah had only been working for a few months, but she had already seen how different every flight could be. Some flights were smooth and peaceful, with passengers quietly reading books or dozing off to sleep. Others, however, were filled with chaos, demanding passengers, and uncomfortable situations. But Sarah always tried to stay calm, no matter what. She knew that it was part of the job to keep things running smoothly. Today, she hoped, would be just like any other ordinary flight. She was excited about the chance to serve the passengers, get through the duties of the day, and hopefully have a peaceful trip to the destination. As the plane taxied down the runway, the crew worked like a well-oiled machine. The flight attendants checked seat belts, made sure everyone had their seat backs upright, and went over the emergency procedures. Everything seemed routine. But what Sarah didn't know was that this particular flight was about to throw her a curveball. Up in first class, a woman named Mrs. Peters sat in her seat, looking around the cabin with a cold, calculating gaze. She was an older woman, in her late 70s, with sharp features and a demeanor that commanded attention. Her gray hair was neatly styled, and her clothes were expensive-looking. Mrs. Peters had a way of carrying herself that let everyone know she was used to getting what she wanted, and quickly. The other passengers in first class gave her polite smiles, but no one dared to interrupt her or speak to her unless spoken to first. The flight was starting to feel like any other. Sarah walked down the aisle, checking on the passengers, making sure everyone had their drinks, snacks, or whatever else they needed. The plane was full, but the passengers were mostly quiet, content with their books or screens. Sarah smiled at them, making small talk as she worked, and tried to ignore the growing anxiety in her chest. She was still getting used to the feeling of being a flight attendant, and sometimes she found the job a little overwhelming. But today, everything was going smoothly. That is, until she reached Mrs. Peters' row. At first, it was just a simple request. Mrs. Peters raised her hand, her fingers elegantly held together, like she was about to ask a question in a meeting. Sarah approached her with a friendly smile, hoping to offer excellent service as she always did. "Yes, ma'am. How can I help you?" Sarah asked, her voice polite and professional. Mrs. Peters didn't smile back. She didn't even acknowledge Sarah's friendly greeting. Instead, she simply looked up at Sarah with a stare that could freeze water. "I'll have a glass of water," Mrs. Peters said, her voice low but firm. It wasn't a request, it was more of an order. Sarah felt a little taken aback. It wasn't that Mrs. Peters was being rude, but there was something in the way she said it that made Sarah feel small, almost as if she were an inconvenience just by being there. Sarah nodded quickly and turned to go, but Mrs. Peters stopped her. "And don't take too long," she added sharply. Sarah blinked, a little surprised. She had seen many types of passengers during her time on flights, but Mrs. Peters was different. There was a coldness in her tone that made Sarah feel uncomfortable. She wasn't sure why, but something about Mrs. Peters made her feel uneasy. Trying not to let it show, Sarah turned around and walked down the aisle to grab the water. As she moved past the other passengers, she could feel their eyes on her. Some were busy talking to their own seatmates, but others seemed to be watching the interaction closely. Sarah didn't know if it was because Mrs. Peters was important or just because she was being so demanding. Either way, Sarah couldn't help but feel a small knot in her stomach. She quickly returned to Mrs. Peters with the water, hoping to keep things smooth and easy. But as Sarah approached her, Mrs. Peters didn't even glance at her. Instead, she simply held out her hand, waiting for the glass. Sarah offered it to her, but Mrs. Peters didn't thank her. There wasn't even a hint of a smile. She just grabbed the glass and took a sip, her eyes still fixed ahead, as if Sarah were invisible. Feeling awkward, Sarah took a step back and began to turn away, but Mrs. Peters wasn't done yet. "Is this the best you can do?" Mrs. Peters asked, her voice cutting through the air. "I asked for this water when we first took off, and I had to wait this long." Sarah froze for a moment. It wasn't that Mrs. Peters was yelling or raising her voice, but her words were sharp, like a knife. Sarah hadn't been aware of when Mrs. Peters had asked for the water, but it didn't matter. The tone in her voice made it clear that Sarah wasn't meeting her expectations, and that made Sarah feel embarrassed. "I'm so sorry, ma'am," Sarah replied quickly, trying to apologize and get away from the situation. "There's just a lot going on, and I'm trying to get to everyone." Mrs. Peters simply nodded, but she didn't seem to accept Sarah's apology. Instead, she just took another sip of the water, still glaring straight ahead. It was like she didn't even care that Sarah was standing there, just trying to do her job. Sarah walked away, her heart pounding in her chest. It wasn't that she was afraid of Mrs. Peters, but there was something unsettling about the way she treated her. This wasn't the first time Sarah had encountered a passenger who was a little demanding, but Mrs. Peters felt different. Sarah couldn't quite put her finger on it, but she knew this wouldn't be the last time she'd feel the weight of Mrs. Peters' judgment. As the flight went on, Sarah tried to focus on her duties and keep her mind occupied. But no matter what she did, she couldn't shake the feeling that Mrs. Peters was watching her. It was like the woman was waiting for Sarah to mess up, just so she could pounce on her. The rest of the flight went by without incident, but Sarah could feel the tension in the air. She couldn't help but think about what had happened earlier with Mrs. Peters. Why had the woman treated her like that? What had she done wrong? As the plane began its descent, Sarah felt a nervous energy building inside her. The passengers were preparing for landing, and she was making her final rounds down the aisle. Everyone was getting ready to leave, to go back to their normal lives. But for Sarah, nothing felt normal anymore. The thought of seeing Mrs. Peters again made her stomach turn. And as the plane touched down and the seatbelt sign turned off, Sarah had no idea just how much her life was about to change in the next few minutes. Sarah made her way through the aisle, checking on the passengers and preparing for the landing. The small clink of the seatbelt signs being turned off and the soft hum of the engines as they descended didn't seem to offer her any comfort today. As she approached Mrs. Peters once more, she felt a knot of anxiety in her stomach. Mrs. Peters was already beginning to gather her things, putting away her magazine and adjusting her coat. She looked up at Sarah with a glance that sent a shiver down her spine, but Sarah tried to stay calm. She had a job to do, and she couldn't let this one passenger get under her skin. "Is there anything else I can assist you with, Mrs. Peters?" Sarah asked in her best professional tone. Mrs. Peters didn't answer right away. Instead, she took a moment to look Sarah up and down, almost as if deciding whether Sarah was worthy of a response. When she finally spoke, her voice was cold and dismissive. "No, just make sure this flight goes more smoothly next time," Mrs. Peters said with a wave of her hand. "I don't want to deal with any more delays or bad service." Sarah felt the sting of the words. She had done her best, and still, it wasn't enough. But she kept her face neutral, nodding politely as she tried to hide her frustration. "Yes, ma'am. I'll make sure everything is in order." As she moved away, Sarah felt the weight of Mrs. Peters' judgment hanging over her like a cloud. She knew she had done everything she could, but somehow, that didn't seem to matter. The plane finally landed, and Sarah helped the passengers prepare to disembark. She greeted them with a smile, but inside, her mind was racing. She was tired. She was frustrated. And she was beginning to feel like she couldn't do anything right. As the last few passengers filed off the plane, Sarah's manager, Greg, approached her. He was an older man, with years of experience in the airline industry. He had seen everything, and he was usually calm and collected. But today, his face was tense, and there was a hint of concern in his eyes. "Sarah, can you come with me for a moment?" Greg asked, his tone firm but not unkind. Sarah's heart sank. She knew something was wrong, but she didn't know what. She followed Greg down the narrow aisle and into the back of the plane, where they stood in a small, quiet space by the galley. "I need to talk to you about Mrs. Peters," Greg said, glancing around to make sure no one was listening. "She's made a formal complaint." Sarah's stomach dropped. She couldn't believe it. A complaint? After everything that had happened, Mrs. Peters was complaining about her? I don't understand," Sarah stammered. "I did everything I could. She was rude, but I tried to give her good service." Greg sighed and rubbed his forehead. "I know. But Mrs. Peters says you were disrespectful to her. She claims you ignored her request for water and that you were unprofessional throughout the flight." Sarah was speechless. She had tried her best to stay calm, to be professional, but it seemed that wasn't enough for Mrs. Peters. The more she thought about it, the more frustrated she became. It wasn't fair. Mrs. Peters had been the one to make things difficult, not her. "I didn't ignore her request," Sarah protested. "I brought her the water as quickly as I could, and I was doing my job. I don't know why she would say that." "I'm not saying you did anything wrong, Sarah," Greg said, his voice softening. "But Mrs. Peters is very influential, and she's made a big deal out of this. She's already contacted corporate, and they're looking into it." The words hit Sarah like a ton of bricks. This was bad. Really bad. She had never been in trouble like this before. She had worked hard to get this job, and now it felt like it was slipping away from her. "I don't know what to do," Sarah said, her voice cracking. "I've never been in a situation like this before. It feels like I can't win, no matter what I do." Greg gave her a sympathetic look. "I know. But for now, just lay low. Stay professional. Let's see what corporate says. If they decide to take action, we'll handle it then." Sarah nodded, but her mind was spinning. She couldn't shake the feeling that everything she had worked for was at risk because of one unhappy passenger. But there was nothing she could do now but wait. The next few days were a blur. Sarah tried to focus on her work, but she couldn't stop thinking about the complaint. She kept replaying the incident in her head, wondering if she could have done something differently, if she could have handled Mrs. Peters' demands in a way that would have prevented all of this from happening. She was exhausted. The stress from the complaint weighed on her, and she found herself snapping at her co-workers, even though she knew they weren't the ones to blame. Sarah just felt lost. She didn't know how to fix this, or if she even could. Finally, she received an email from corporate. It was short and to the point, asking her to come in for a meeting. Her stomach twisted with nervousness. She had no idea what they were going to say, but she knew it wasn't going to be good. When the day of the meeting arrived, Sarah showed up early, her palms sweaty and her heart pounding. She sat in the small conference room, staring at the door, waiting for someone to come in. A few minutes later, Greg walked in, followed by a tall woman in a suit. She looked serious, her expression unreadable as she sat down across from Sarah. "Sarah, this is Ms. Lawson," Greg said. "She's from corporate, and she's here to discuss the situation with Mrs. Peters." Ms. Lawson didn't greet Sarah with a smile. Instead, she opened a folder in front of her and began to review the documents inside. It was clear she had already made up her mind. "We've looked into the complaint," Ms. Lawson said, her voice cold and businesslike. "And while we understand your side of the story, we have to take Mrs. Peters' concerns seriously. She is a valued customer, and her feedback is important." Sarah's chest tightened as she listened. She had hoped for a fair chance, but it seemed like Mrs. Peters' word was more important than hers. "We've decided," Ms. Lawson continued, "that we're going to issue a formal warning. If we receive another complaint, we'll have to take further action. Sarah felt like the air had been knocked out of her. A warning? That was it. She had worked so hard to prove herself, and now all of that seemed to mean nothing. I understand, Sarah said, her voice barely a whisper. Ms. Lawson gave a small nod. Good. We'll expect you to handle yourself more professionally in the future. This is your last chance, Sarah. The meeting ended quickly after that, and Sarah left the room feeling numb. She had made it through, but she couldn't shake the feeling that she had been treated unfairly. Mrs. Peters had won. And Sarah, despite doing her best, had lost. At first, Sarah didn't think much of it when Mrs. Peters asked for a glass of water. After all, it was a small request. Most passengers had similar requests during a flight, whether it was for a blanket, a pillow, or a drink. It was all part of the job. But as Sarah made her way back to the galley to get the water, something about Mrs. Peters' tone stayed with her. There was an edge to it, something that felt off. It wasn't just the request itself. It was how Mrs. Peters had said it. She didn't ask kindly, the way most passengers did. She didn't smile or even make small talk, like others sometimes did. No, Mrs. Peters had spoken as though she believed she was entitled to special treatment. As though everyone else on the plane should cater to her every need without question. This wasn't the first time Sarah had dealt with demanding passengers, but something about Mrs. Peters felt different. Maybe it was her icy stare or the way she seemed to look right through Sarah, as if she didn't matter at all. Whatever it was, Sarah could feel the weight of it. Still, it wasn't a huge deal. Sarah reminded herself that she had seen it all before. Passengers could be demanding sometimes, but as long as she did her job well, everything would be fine. The plane was flying smoothly, and Sarah moved quickly through the cabin, offering drinks and checking on passengers. But when she returned with the water for Mrs. Peters, that familiar feeling of unease returned. As she approached, she could feel the eyes of the other passengers on her. Most of them were sitting in their seats, some chatting quietly, others reading or scrolling on their phones. But there was a quiet tension in the air. It was like the entire cabin was holding its breath, waiting to see what would happen next. Sarah smiled politely as she walked toward Mrs. Peters. "Here you go, ma'am. A glass of water," she said, trying to keep her voice warm and friendly. But as soon as she handed the glass to Mrs. Peters, the woman's eyes narrowed. Her lips twisted into a small frown, and Sarah could feel the temperature in the cabin drop. "I asked for it sooner," Mrs. Peters said sharply. The words cut through the air like a knife, and Sarah's smile faltered slightly. She wasn't sure what to say. It wasn't that Mrs. Peters had been rude, at least not outright. But the tone, the way she had said it, made it clear that this wasn't just a casual request. It was an order. Sarah felt her heart beat faster. She was used to dealing with all kinds of people on the plane, but this felt different. Mrs. Peters wasn't just any passenger. She was someone who clearly expected the world to bend to her will. And now, the other passengers around them were watching closely, some even glancing up from their seats to see how Sarah would respond. The pressure was mounting. Everyone's eyes were on Sarah. She could feel their gaze, waiting for her to make a move. It wasn't just Mrs. Peters who was watching her now. It was everyone. Sarah stood there for a moment, trying to figure out what to do. She could feel the weight of the situation in her chest. On one hand, she had a job to do. She couldn't afford to start a scene or make things uncomfortable. But on the other hand, Mrs. Peters had just disrespected her in front of everyone. Sarah had always been taught to keep her composure in difficult situations, but this felt different. She could either let it slide and keep the peace, or she could stand her ground and risk making things worse. But what would it cost her if she stood up to Mrs. Peters? Would the passengers turn against her? Would her supervisor, Greg, hear about it? Would it affect her job? The possibilities were endless, and none of them seemed good. Sarah took a deep breath, trying to steady her nerves. She knew she had to say something. She had to at least let Mrs. Peters know that she wasn't going to let herself be treated this way. But before Sarah could speak, Mrs. Peters spoke again. I asked for this water when we first took off, and it took you this long to bring it to me. Mrs. Peters said, her voice dripping with sarcasm. I expect better service than this. A hot rush of anger surged through Sarah's veins. She could feel her face turning red, but she bit her lip and held back the words that wanted to spill out. Instead, she forced a smile, though it was much harder to keep up this time. I'm sorry, ma'am, Sarah said, trying to keep her voice calm. There's a lot going on, and I'm doing my best to get to everyone. I apologize for the wait. But Mrs. Peters wasn't satisfied with that. She didn't even acknowledge Sarah's apology. Instead, she took the water with a stiff nod, as though Sarah hadn't even spoken. Sarah turned to walk away, but the weight of the situation still hung heavy in the air. She could feel the eyes of the passengers on her back. The tension in the cabin was palpable. The simple act of handing someone a glass of water had somehow become a scene, and Sarah was stuck in the middle of it. As she walked down the aisle, Sarah's mind raced. Why had Mrs. Peters treated her that way? She had been nothing but polite, and all she had done was her job. Was it because she was new? Was it because she was younger? Or was it simply because Mrs. Peters thought she could get away with it? The rest of the flight was uneventful, but Sarah couldn't shake the feeling of discomfort that lingered in her chest. She kept replaying the incident over and over in her head, wondering if she had done something wrong. Had she been too slow? Too nervous? Should she have stood up to Mrs. Peters in that moment? The more Sarah thought about it, the angrier she became. She had done nothing wrong, and yet here she was, feeling like she had to apologize for simply doing her job. The tension wasn't just in the cabin, it was in her body too. She felt tight and uncomfortable, like a knot was forming inside her. It wasn't just Mrs. Peters. It was everything that had been building up. The pressure of trying to meet expectations, of dealing with difficult passengers, of working long hours for little recognition. It was all starting to get to Sarah. As the plane began its descent, Sarah walked through the aisle once more, checking in on the passengers. The same passengers who had witnessed the awkward exchange earlier were still in their seats, but now, it felt like they were avoiding her. Maybe they hadn't meant to, but there was a tension between them. Sarah felt like everyone was silently judging her, as if they expected her to apologize for something. She wasn't sure what, but it didn't matter. She was being judged, and it made her feel small. When the plane finally landed, Sarah did her best to hold it together. She smiled at the passengers as they stood to leave, wishing them a pleasant day as they exited the plane. But as the last passenger disembarked, Sarah felt a weight on her chest. She was relieved that the flight was over, but she couldn't shake the feeling that she had somehow failed. She had tried to do everything right, but it wasn't enough. Just then, her manager Greg walked over to her. His usual friendly demeanor seemed a little more serious today, and Sarah felt a sinking feeling in her stomach. She had seen Greg before after difficult situations, and she knew that he would want to talk to her about what had happened. Sarah, can I talk to you for a minute? Greg asked, his voice calm but firm. Sarah nodded, trying to hold back the anxiety building in her chest. Sure, Greg. What's going on? Greg glanced around to make sure no one was listening, then lowered his voice. I heard about what happened with Mrs. Peters. I just wanted to check in with you. Sarah's heart skipped a beat. She had been expecting this, but hearing it out loud made it all feel real. I didn't do anything wrong, Sarah said quickly, feeling defensive. She was rude to me for no reason. I tried to do my job. Greg sighed, rubbing his temple. I know, Sarah. But you have to understand, Mrs. Peters is a very important customer. She's a frequent flyer, and she's always been very particular about her service. That didn't make Sarah feel any better. So, what does that mean for me? She asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Greg gave her a sad look. It means that we have to take her complaints seriously. I'm not saying you did anything wrong, but you need to handle situations like this better in the future. Sarah's chest tightened. It wasn't fair. She had done her best. But Greg didn't seem to get it. I'll try, Sarah said, forcing herself to sound calm. But inside, she was seething. She had tried to be patient, tried to keep things professional. But in the end, it didn't matter. Mrs. Peters had won. She had gotten her way, and Sarah had been left with nothing but the pressure of knowing that she might not be able to keep her job if she made another mistake. As Sarah walked away from Greg, she felt defeated. She had been treated unfairly, and yet there was nothing she could do about it. Mrs. Peters had the power, and Sarah was just a flight attendant. As Sarah made her way back to the galley, she felt the weight of the conversation with Greg settle heavily on her shoulders. The moment she had hoped to avoid had arrived, and now she was left with the sting of the unfairness that seemed to follow her like a shadow. Mrs. Peters had managed to get exactly what she wanted, and Sarah felt small and powerless in the aftermath. She had been nothing but polite, had done her job as best as she could. But in the eyes of the company, it was Mrs. Peters who had the power, who had the voice that would be listened to. The cabin began to clear out as passengers made their way to the exits. Sarah watched as they walked by, some nodding politely, others looking away quickly. A few smiled at her, offering their thanks, but it didn't make her feel any better. The moment with Mrs. Peters lingered in the air like a cloud. It wasn't just the woman's rudeness, it was the entire situation. It was the fact that, despite her best efforts, Sarah had been made to feel less than. She had tried to offer a level of service that met expectations, but that hadn't been enough. Mrs. Peters hadn't even been grateful. It was as if she had expected more and had found fault with Sarah for not meeting her invisible standard. As Sarah continued her walk down the aisle, collecting trash and helping passengers with their belongings, she began to wonder if she was just too naive for this job. The thought stung. She had always prided herself on her kindness and patience. But maybe in this world, those qualities weren't enough. Maybe she needed to be more assertive, more willing to stand up for herself, more like Mrs. Peters. But that wasn't who Sarah was. She couldn't change who she was overnight, even if it meant facing the uncomfortable reality of dealing with entitled passengers. Sarah had always believed in kindness, but Mrs. Peters' behavior had shaken her belief that being nice could make a difference. It seemed as though no matter how hard she tried, there would always be someone who would take advantage of her politeness. As Sarah placed the final trash bag in the storage compartment and turned toward the cockpit, her mind wandered back to her conversation with Greg. The weight of his words was heavy. He hadn't said anything overtly harsh, but the implication was clear: Sarah wasn't just doing her job poorly. She had failed to meet the unspoken expectations of an important customer. The problem was, she hadn't known what those expectations were. No one had ever told her what Mrs. Peters needed or wanted, and now, she was left with the sense that she was not only a disappointment to her manager, but also to herself. It wasn't just the flight that had been uncomfortable, it was the emotional toll of having her character questioned. She had always prided herself on being someone who worked hard, who put in the effort to make people feel comfortable, and now that she was being told that wasn't enough, she didn't know how to react. It was as though her self-worth was suddenly tied to a standard she couldn't even see. When the plane finally landed and Sarah helped with the final passenger deboarding, she felt a sense of relief. This flight was over. But the relief was temporary. Deep down, Sarah knew that it wasn't just about this one flight. It was about something bigger. It was about how she was treated, how she was expected to bend over backward for others, and how, in the end, her value seemed to be defined by how well she could make others happy. As Sarah walked out of the terminal and into the crew lounge, she noticed the familiar faces of her colleagues. They were chatting and laughing, but as Sarah entered, their conversations quieted, and their eyes turned toward her. It wasn't a look of concern or curiosity, it was a look of pity. Sarah's stomach sank. She knew what they were thinking. Word had already spread. Mrs. Peters had likely made her complaint known, and now Sarah was the subject of some whispered conversation. Her colleagues, the ones who had once been her support, now seemed like strangers. Sarah felt herself shrinking under their gaze. She tried to force a smile, but it didn't reach her eyes. She sat down quietly at the table, feeling like she was just waiting for someone to approach her, to ask her about what had happened, or to tell her what to do next. But no one said anything. Instead, they went back to their conversations, occasionally throwing her a quick glance. As the shift came to an end, Sarah's thoughts became clouded with uncertainty. She hadn't been able to shake the feeling that her job was hanging by a thread. Mrs. Peters' complaint had cast a shadow over everything she had worked for. She didn't know if she would even be able to stay on this job much longer, and the thought of losing it made her feel both angry and scared. But the truth was, Sarah wasn't sure where to go from here. She didn't know how to confront her manager or deal with the fact that she had been made to feel so small. She didn't know if she could keep pretending everything was fine when everything inside her was telling her it wasn't. She didn't know how to stand up for herself without fearing the consequences. As the days went by, the tension between Sarah and her colleagues remained. She couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched, that every move she made was being scrutinized. No one ever directly confronted her about the incident with Mrs. Peters, but it didn't matter. The undercurrent of tension was always there. And then, one day, Sarah got called into Greg's office. She knew what this meeting was about, and as she walked toward the office, her heart pounded in her chest. She braced herself for what was coming. When she entered the office, Greg was already sitting at his desk, his hands folded in front of him. His face was serious, and Sarah immediately felt a lump form in her throat. She had no idea what he was going to say, but she could already feel the weight of it. "Sarah, I wanted to talk to you about your performance on the last flight," Greg said, his voice steady but firm. Sarah nodded, her hands clutching the edge of the chair as she sat down. "I know, Greg. I know it wasn't perfect. But I did the best I could. I was trying to be polite to Mrs. Peters, and I didn't expect the situation to get so out of hand." Greg nodded slowly, his eyes studying her. "I understand that, Sarah. And I want to be clear, I don't think you did anything wrong. But you need to understand that in this job, sometimes you have to go above and beyond to satisfy difficult passengers. Mrs. Peters is one of our most loyal customers, and her opinion carries weight." Sarah's heart sank. "So, I'm being punished for something that wasn't my fault?" Greg's eyes softened a little. "I'm not punishing you, Sarah. But I need you to understand that sometimes, you have to make decisions in the moment. You can't always wait for things to blow over. You need to act quickly, and sometimes, that means putting yourself in a position where you don't come out on top. But it's all part of learning how to handle these situations." Sarah sat silently for a moment, trying to process everything Greg had said. She wanted to scream, to tell him how unfair it all was, but she knew that wouldn't solve anything. Instead, she nodded, accepting the reality of the situation, even though it hurt. "I'll do better next time," Sarah said quietly, though inside, she wasn't so sure. As she left Greg's office and walked back to the crew lounge, Sarah felt defeated. She didn't know what was worse, being told that she had failed, or realizing that, in the end, it didn't matter what she did. Mrs. Peters had the power. Mrs. Peters had always had the power. And Sarah? She was just another person on a long list of people who had to do whatever it took to make sure the important customers were happy, even if that meant losing a little bit of herself along the way. The tension in the air was thick, like a storm cloud just before it bursts. Sarah could feel every pair of eyes in the cabin on her, and she had the sudden urge to shrink into the nearest corner. But she couldn't. Not now. Not when Mrs. Peters had just loudly demanded to speak with her supervisor, making it clear that she wasn't just upset, she was furious. Sarah took a deep breath, trying to steady her racing heart. She'd dealt with difficult passengers before, but this situation felt different. Mrs. Peters wasn't just an upset customer, she was someone who expected to be treated like royalty, someone who thought she was above everyone else. And that made this much harder. But Sarah knew one thing for sure, she couldn't back down. Not this time. "I'll get my supervisor," Sarah said, her voice steady despite the turmoil inside her. She forced herself to walk to the front of the plane, feeling the eyes of the passengers on her every step. Her hands were clammy, and her stomach churned, but she kept walking, determined to face whatever was coming. As Sarah approached the galley, she saw Greg, her manager, talking to another crew member. She knew this was going to be a difficult conversation. She didn't want to get in trouble. She didn't want to make things worse. But she also knew that standing up for herself was the right thing to do. "Greg," Sarah called out, her voice sounding smaller than she meant it to. "Mrs. Peters in first class, she wants to speak with you. She says I've treated her poorly, and she's demanding to speak with a supervisor." Greg looked up at Sarah, his expression unreadable. He didn't seem surprised, but his eyes flickered with a hint of disappointment. "Okay, Sarah. I'll go speak with her. You stay here for now." Sarah nodded, trying to hide her nervousness. She wasn't sure what to expect, but she knew that this could be a turning point. How would Greg handle the situation? Would he believe Mrs. Peters, or would he see things from her side? As Greg made his way toward the front of the plane, Sarah stood there, feeling exposed and vulnerable. She couldn't help but think about all the times she had worked hard to make sure every passenger was happy, every need was met. But no one had ever noticed the effort she put in. They only saw the mistakes. They only saw when things went wrong. And now, it seemed like Mrs. Peters was getting all the attention. Sarah could hear Mrs. Peters' voice rising again, her words cutting through the quiet cabin. "This is outrageous. How dare you let someone like her serve me?" The tone was sharp, like a knife slicing through the air. Sarah's heart sank as she listened to the words. They felt like a punch in the gut. How could anyone say something like that? She wasn't perfect, but she had always tried her best. Yet here was someone, judging her as if she didn't matter, as if her hard work meant nothing. She didn't know how much longer she could take this. The anger inside her was growing, but she knew better than to let it show. She had to stay calm. She had to stay professional. Minutes passed, but it felt like hours. Sarah paced back and forth in the galley, her thoughts racing. What was going on up front? Was Greg taking Mrs. Peters' side? Did she really have a chance to stand up for herself? Finally, Greg returned to the galley. His face was calm, but his eyes were hard, his jaw clenched. He didn't speak right away, and Sarah's stomach twisted with anxiety. "Greg?" Sarah asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Greg exhaled slowly, running a hand through his hair. "Sarah, I don't know what happened back there, but Mrs. Peters is upset. She says you were rude to her. She says you didn't bring her water quickly enough, and that you treated her with disrespect." Sarah's eyes widened. "But Greg, I didn't do anything wrong. I brought her the water as soon as I could. I tried to be polite, but she kept demanding things, and then she said things that weren't true." Greg sighed, looking at her with a mixture of concern and frustration. "I understand, Sarah. But you need to remember that customers like Mrs. Peters are important. She's been flying with us for years, and her opinion matters. You need to be more careful with how you handle these situations. It's not just about doing your job, it's about making sure the customer feels respected." Sarah felt her chest tighten. She couldn't believe what she was hearing. So, it was all about the customer, wasn't it? No matter how they treated her, no matter how rude or demanding they were, it was her job to cater to them. It didn't matter if she was right. It didn't matter if she had been treated unfairly. What mattered was keeping the customer happy, even if that meant sacrificing her own dignity. I understand, Sarah said, her voice barely audible. She didn't know what else to say. She was starting to feel defeated, like the fight wasn't worth it. It wasn't worth standing up for herself if it meant losing her job. Greg looked at her for a long moment, as though weighing his next words carefully. I know this is tough, Sarah. But you need to learn how to handle difficult passengers better. Mrs. Peters isn't the only one who's going to test you. There will be more passengers like her, and you need to figure out how to stay calm under pressure. Sarah nodded, her throat tight. She didn't want to argue. She didn't want to make things worse. But she couldn't help but feel a sense of injustice. Why should she have to be the one to change? Why couldn't Mrs. Peters just be a little more understanding? Why couldn't people see that she was just doing her job, trying her best? As Sarah walked back to her position, she couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted. She wasn't just a flight attendant anymore. She was a scapegoat, a target for customers like Mrs. Peters to take out their frustrations on. She was a servant, expected to bend to the whims of others, no matter how rude or unfair. But Sarah wasn't the kind of person to just accept that. She had been tested before, and she had come out stronger. She had learned to be patient, to listen, and to smile even when it was hard. She had learned to keep her head down and keep working, no matter what. But this was different. This wasn't just about customer service. This was about respect. And somewhere, deep inside, Sarah knew that it wasn't just about this flight. It wasn't just about Mrs. Peters. It was about a lot more than that. It was about finding her voice, standing up for herself, and not letting anyone walk all over her. As the flight continued, Sarah found herself watching Mrs. Peters from across the aisle. The woman was still sitting there, with her arms crossed and her lips pursed, as though she was the queen of the skies. But Sarah didn't feel afraid anymore. She didn't feel like she had to apologize for something that wasn't her fault. This was the moment, she realized. This was the moment she had been waiting for, the moment when she would stop being a doormat and start standing up for herself. No matter what it cost her, she wasn't going to let anyone treat her like she didn't matter. She wasn't going to let anyone make her feel small anymore. And so, as the flight went on, Sarah made a silent promise to herself: the next time someone tried to push her around, she would stand her ground. She would do her job, but she would do it with the confidence that came from knowing her worth. Because she deserved that much. As Sarah walked back to her station, her mind raced. The cabin was quiet, and the sounds of the engines hummed in the background, but her thoughts were anything but peaceful. The way Mrs. Peters had spoken to her, it was more than just rudeness, it was a power play, an attempt to make Sarah feel small. But that wasn't going to happen. Not this time. She couldn't stop thinking about the words Greg had said. You need to handle these situations better. It echoed in her mind. Was that really the best advice? Did she need to just let people walk all over her in the name of customer service? She wasn't sure anymore. Something had shifted inside her. She had always prided herself on being professional, polite, and calm under pressure. But that was starting to feel like a weakness. She glanced at the other passengers seated in their chairs. Some were reading, others were napping, and a few were chatting quietly. Everyone seemed to be going about their business, unaware of the tension that had built up between Sarah and Mrs. Peters. What if she could do something to change this? What if she didn't have to stay silent when people were unfair to her? She didn't have to take it anymore. The thought was like a spark in her mind. It lit up her whole body. What if standing up for herself wasn't just about arguing? What if it was about asserting her dignity, without losing her composure? But just as quickly as that thought appeared, doubt crept in. What if she pushed too hard? What if her job was on the line? Was it worth risking everything over a glass of water? But then she remembered the way Mrs. Peters had spoken. The sharpness in her voice, the way she had treated Sarah like she was invisible, like she didn't matter. Sarah's hands clenched into fists at her sides. no. She wouldn't let that happen anymore. As the flight continued, Sarah went through the motions. She served the other passengers, answered questions, and walked down the aisles with a smile on her face. But her mind kept returning to Mrs. Peters. The woman had made it clear that she felt entitled, and somehow, that made Sarah feel smaller than she had ever felt before. She couldn't let that stand. She couldn't let this be the moment when she backed down. The plane was headed to its destination, and the flight was almost halfway over. She saw Mrs. Peters, sitting in first class, looking like she owned the entire plane. The elderly woman was busy reading a magazine, but Sarah knew better than to think that the matter was over. Mrs. Peters was just waiting for another chance to strike. Sarah was ready for it, though. The hours passed, and Sarah continued to observe Mrs. Peters. Each time Sarah came near, the woman would glance at her, her eyes cold and calculating. She didn't even try to hide her disdain. It was like a game to her. She was looking for weaknesses, for cracks in Sarah's resolve. Sarah stood her ground, though. She didn't let the woman's icy gaze throw her off balance. She was doing her job, and she had every right to be here, just as much as anyone else. As the flight approached its cruising altitude, Sarah decided it was time to take a deep breath. She couldn't ignore the situation forever. She was a flight attendant, not a doormat. It was time to make a decision. She walked down the aisle again, her heart pounding in her chest. Mrs. Peters was sitting by the window now, looking out at the clouds. For a moment, Sarah thought the woman had forgotten about her, but then she saw the way Mrs. Peters subtly turned her head. She knew the game wasn't over yet. Sarah stopped in front of her. Mrs. Peters didn't acknowledge her right away. She just kept staring out of the window, her arms crossed, as though she was waiting for Sarah to speak. "Is there anything else I can get you, Mrs. Peters?" Sarah asked, her voice calm and professional, though the tension was still there. She wasn't sure what to expect, but she was ready for whatever came next. Mrs. Peters turned her head slowly, her gaze cold. "I've already told you what I need. What I deserve. But I guess you just don't care." Sarah felt her jaw tighten. "I do care, Mrs. Peters. I'm just trying to do my job and make sure everyone is comfortable." Mrs. Peters narrowed her eyes. "Comfortable? If you wanted to make me comfortable, you would have done things my way. But you don't know how to treat people with respect, do you?" It was like a slap in the face. Every word from Mrs. Peters stung, but Sarah didn't show it. She stood tall, trying to hold on to her composure. This was it. This was the moment she had been waiting for. "I'm sorry if I've upset you," Sarah said softly. "But I'm doing my best to do my job and make sure everyone is taken care of." She paused, then added, "And I'm just as worthy of respect as you are." Mrs. Peters looked at her, surprised. She wasn't used to being spoken to like that. For a brief moment, Sarah thought she saw something flicker in the woman's eyes. But then it was gone, replaced by a hard look. "You think you're better than me?" Mrs. Peters scoffed. "You're just a flight attendant. I'm a paying customer, and that means I get treated better than you." Sarah felt her heart race, but she didn't back down. "No, Mrs. Peters. It doesn't work that way. Just because you're a paying customer doesn't mean you get to treat others like they're beneath you. We all deserve respect." For a moment, there was silence. Mrs. Peters stared at Sarah, her face contorted in disbelief. She was used to getting what she wanted, but Sarah wasn't going to back down anymore. She wasn't going to let herself be pushed around. The silence stretched on for what felt like forever. And then, finally, Mrs. Peters huffed, her shoulders dropping in defeat. "Fine. Have it your way." Sarah felt a rush of relief. It wasn't victory. It wasn't a happy ending. But it was a step in the right direction. She hadn't given up. She hadn't allowed herself to be silenced. And that was a victory in itself. But just as Sarah was about to turn away, Mrs. Peters spoke again, her voice quieter now, but still sharp. "You'll regret this," she said, her words laced with bitterness. Sarah didn't respond. She didn't have to. She knew what she had done. She had stood up for herself, and that was all that mattered. As she walked back to her station, Sarah felt a sense of empowerment, something she hadn't felt in a long time. Maybe she wasn't just a flight attendant. Maybe she was more than that. She had earned that respect today. And no one, not even someone like Mrs. Peters, could take it away from her. Sarah's heart pounded as she stood there, facing Mrs. Peters with the entire cabin watching. The murmurs of surprise and curiosity rippled through the passengers like a wave. Sarah had always been the quiet type, the one who kept her head down and did her job. But today was different. She wasn't just going to take it anymore. "I'm afraid that won't be possible, Mrs. Peters," Sarah said, her voice steady but carrying an authority she didn't even know she had. It was almost as if the words came from a place deep inside her, a place of quiet strength that had been waiting to emerge. Mrs. Peters' face flushed with anger. "What did you say to me?" she snapped, her voice rising. The other passengers shifted in their seats, trying to get a better view of the situation. It was rare to see a flight attendant stand up to a passenger like this, especially in first class. But Sarah wasn't going to back down. Not now, not after everything that had happened. "I'm afraid I can't allow you to speak to me like that," Sarah continued. "I'm just doing my job, but respect goes both ways." She stood tall, her posture firm and unwavering. Her heart raced, but she didn't show it. She had taken the first step, and there was no turning back now. The tension in the air was thick. Sarah could feel the eyes of the entire plane on her. Some passengers seemed uncomfortable, unsure of what was happening. Others looked on with growing curiosity, like they were witnessing something they'd never expected. And then, there were those who seemed to enjoy the drama unfolding before them. Mrs. Peters' eyes narrowed, and she opened her mouth, clearly about to say something sharp in response. But before she could speak, Sarah held up a hand, signaling for her to stop. "I think it's time for you to meet someone who has a bit more authority than me," Sarah said, her voice calm but with a finality that made everyone in the cabin pause. There was a collective hush. The murmurs stopped. The passengers leaned forward in their seats, eager to hear what Sarah was going to do next. Sarah's heart beat faster as she looked around the cabin, meeting the eyes of several passengers. She knew she had them on her side, and it gave her the courage to continue. Without warning, Sarah stepped away from Mrs. Peters and approached the intercom at the front of the plane. Her fingers brushed against the cold metal, and for a moment, she hesitated. This was it. The moment that would change everything. She pressed the button. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is Sarah, your flight attendant," she began, her voice clear and loud enough to be heard throughout the cabin. "I'd like to introduce you to someone who has the authority to handle this situation. Please allow me to bring Captain Hayes up to speak with you." There was a pause, and the passengers sat in stunned silence. The name of the captain wasn't one they had expected to hear. Captain Hayes was the head of the flight crew, and everyone knew that he didn't usually get involved in customer service issues. He was a professional, a leader in the airline, and his presence would be enough to make anyone take notice. Sarah turned back to Mrs. Peters, who now looked stunned. Her mouth hung open in disbelief. She was no longer in control of the situation. Sarah had turned the tables. "Is there anything else you'd like to discuss, Mrs. Peters?" Sarah asked, her tone cool but firm. "If not, I'll let Captain Hayes handle the rest." Mrs. Peters sputtered for a moment, her face turning an even deeper shade of red. She opened her mouth, but no words came out. It was clear that she wasn't used to being treated this way, and for a moment, Sarah saw something different in her eyes, a flicker of realization. Just then, the door to the cockpit opened, and Captain Hayes emerged. He walked calmly down the aisle, his steps measured and steady. The passengers seemed to hold their breath as he made his way toward the front of the cabin. There was no mistaking his presence. He wasn't just any pilot, he was the captain of this flight, and when he spoke, people listened. He stopped in front of Mrs. Peters, his gaze cool and professional. "Is there a problem here, Mrs. Peters?" he asked, his voice deep and calm. Mrs. Peters opened her mouth, but the words didn't come. She had been so certain of her power, so sure that she could control the situation, but now she was facing someone who commanded respect. "I'm Captain Hayes," the pilot said, his voice unwavering. "I understand there's been some misunderstanding. But let me make this clear, we treat all passengers with respect, no matter who they are or what they think they're entitled to." The silence in the cabin was deafening. The passengers were glued to their seats, their eyes locked on the scene in front of them. Sarah couldn't help but feel a surge of pride. She had done it. She had stood up for herself, and now the situation was in the hands of someone who could truly bring it to an end. Mrs. Peters looked from Sarah to Captain Hayes, and then, for the first time, her posture faltered. She wasn't the same confident woman who had demanded things from Sarah. She was smaller now, uncertain, and Sarah could see it. "I'm very sorry," Mrs. Peters said, her voice dripping with forced politeness. "I didn't mean to cause any trouble." Sarah remained silent, watching as Captain Hayes continued to stand firm. He nodded at Mrs. Peters, but his eyes were sharp. "I suggest you remember this moment, Mrs. Peters. We don't tolerate disrespect in this airline, and we certainly don't allow passengers to bully our staff. Do I make myself clear?" Mrs. Peters nodded quickly, her face pale. She couldn't say anything else. She had lost, and she knew it. Captain Hayes turned to Sarah and gave her a nod of approval. "Thank you for handling the situation professionally," he said. "You did the right thing." Sarah felt a wave of relief wash over her. The tension in her chest finally started to ease. She had stood her ground, and now, she could finally breathe. The passengers seemed to relax too, and some even nodded in her direction, as if offering their silent support. But Sarah wasn't done yet. She knew that standing up to Mrs. Peters wasn't just about winning a small battle, it was about something much bigger. It was about respect. It was about making sure that no one, not even someone like Mrs. Peters, could take away her dignity. As Captain Hayes returned to the cockpit and the flight continued, Sarah stood in the aisle, her hands steady at her sides. She had earned something today, a sense of self-respect, a quiet strength that she hadn't realized was there all along. And as she looked out the window, watching the clouds pass by, she knew one thing for certain: she wasn't just a flight attendant anymore. She was someone who knew her worth. And that made all the difference. The plane began its descent. The rumbling of the engines and the gentle lurch of the aircraft told everyone that they were going to land earlier than expected. The passengers, once bustling with conversation, now sat in eerie silence. They all knew something big had just happened. A few moments after Captain Hayes had made his announcement, the intercom crackled again. It was his voice again, and this time, it was firm and clear. "Ladies and gentlemen, I regret to inform you that due to a serious incident, we are forced to make an unscheduled landing. Mrs. Peters will be escorted off the plane for disruptive behavior." Sarah could feel her heart pounding in her chest. She'd done it. She'd taken control of the situation, and now, everyone would see that no one, no matter how rich, how important, or how entitled they seemed, could get away with being disrespectful. The passengers were stunned. Some of them glanced around at each other, trying to process what they had just heard. They hadn't expected the situation to escalate like this, but at the same time, it felt right. It felt like justice was being served. The plane began its descent, and Sarah kept her calm. She was proud of how she'd handled everything. As the aircraft neared the runway, she walked down the aisle, past the still silent passengers. She had done what she needed to do. She had stood her ground. And in that moment, she felt stronger than she ever had before. When the plane touched down, the tires screeched against the tarmac. The landing was smooth but quick, and within moments, the aircraft had come to a complete stop. The door opened, and the crew prepared for what would be an unexpected landing. A few minutes later, Sarah saw the security team enter the cabin. They moved with purpose, their uniforms sharp and their faces serious. They were here to handle the situation. "Mrs. Peters," one of the security officers said in a calm but firm voice. "We'll need to ask you to leave the aircraft." Mrs. Peters, who had been sitting stiffly in her seat, stood up slowly. Her face was flushed with anger and embarrassment. The confidence she had once carried with her now seemed to have disappeared. She had no choice but to follow the orders given to her. The passengers watched in silence as the security officers escorted Mrs. Peters off the plane. No one said anything. Some of them simply shook their heads. Others stared out the window, lost in thought. They all knew something important had just happened. They had witnessed someone stand up for what was right. As Sarah stood by the galley, watching Mrs. Peters leave the plane, she couldn't help but feel a sense of relief wash over her. She had done the right thing. She had done what was needed, even when it was hard. The security officers returned to the plane, and one of them nodded toward Sarah. "It's all taken care of," he said. Sarah smiled. She felt a weight lift from her shoulders. The passengers slowly started to talk again, some quietly discussing the strange turn of events. But now, the mood was different. It was lighter. There was a sense of justice in the air, a feeling that what had just happened was exactly what needed to be done. As the plane continued on its way, Sarah made her way back to her seat in the crew area. She sat down, feeling exhausted but proud. Her hands were still a little shaky, but the nervousness she had felt earlier had disappeared. She had stood up for herself and for everyone else. She had stood up for respect. And she knew, deep down, that it had made a difference. When the flight finally landed at its destination, the passengers began to gather their things. Sarah was finishing up her duties when one of the passengers, a young woman sitting near the front, approached her. "I just want to say thank you," the woman said with a warm smile. "You handled that situation so well. I don't think I could have done what you did." Sarah smiled back, feeling a warmth spread through her chest. "Thank you," she said softly. "I just did what I had to do." As the passengers disembarked, some offered words of appreciation. Sarah didn't expect anything in return. She didn't do it for praise. But it was nice to know that her actions had made a difference. As the flight crew gathered in the terminal, Captain Hayes approached Sarah. He gave her a nod of respect, the kind of nod that only comes from someone who truly understands the value of what you've done. "You did a good job today, Sarah," he said. "Not everyone has the courage to stand up for themselves like you did. You handled it with professionalism and dignity. You should be proud." Sarah smiled, feeling a sense of pride fill her chest. She had done more than just do her job. She had shown the world what it meant to stand up for what was right. She had set an example for herself and for others. As the crew began to head to their next gate, Sarah felt a new sense of confidence. The experience had changed her. She had learned that respect wasn't something you just gave to others, it was something you earned, something you had to stand up for, even when it wasn't easy. And in doing so, she had found a strength she never knew she had. And as Sarah looked out the window of the terminal, watching the planes take off into the sky, she realized one thing: sometimes, the hardest moments in life are the ones that teach us the most about who we are. And Sarah had learned, without a doubt, that she was someone who would never back down from what was right. The plane had landed safely, and Sarah stood by the terminal window, gazing out at the bustling world around her. The day was over, but the events that had unfolded on the flight still lingered in her mind. She thought back to the tense moments when she had to stand up for herself, when she had refused to back down in the face of disrespect. Sarah was just like many other flight attendants, quiet, hard-working, and dedicated to doing her job. She wasn't the loudest person in the room, and she didn't seek attention. But in that moment, she had found a power inside herself that no one had expected. And maybe, just maybe, it wasn't about being loud or bold. It was about knowing when to stand firm, even when the world seemed to be pressing down on you. Sometimes, the quietest people in the room are the ones with the most power. It doesn't matter if you're not the loudest voice or the one everyone expects to take charge. In moments like this, it's the ones who know when to stand their ground and when to speak up who make all the difference. Sarah had learned that lesson the hard way. For so long, she had kept her head down and stayed out of the spotlight. She did her job without complaint, always focused on serving others. But today, when Mrs. Peters had pushed her too far, Sarah had found her strength. She hadn't just let things slide. She had faced the challenge head-on, and in doing so, she had gained respect not just from the passengers, but from herself. As Sarah thought about everything that had happened, she couldn't help but feel a sense of pride. She had shown that even the most quiet person could make a loud impact when it counted. She had stood up for herself, and she had set an example for everyone around her. And now, as she stood in the terminal, she felt more confident than ever before. The world may overlook you, but when your time comes, you'll be ready. It doesn't matter if people think you're too quiet, too shy, or too small. What matters is what's inside you. It's the courage to speak up when it's needed, the strength to stay true to yourself, and the knowledge that sometimes, it's the quiet ones who are the strongest. Sarah had always been the quiet one. But now, she knew that her silence was not a weakness. It was her strength. It had allowed her to observe, to listen, and to learn when the right time was to act. And when the time came, she had acted with courage and dignity. The passengers on the flight had seen it, too. They had witnessed the power of someone who didn't shout to be heard, but who simply stood tall in the face of adversity. And that, Sarah realized, was the kind of power that truly mattered. It wasn't about making noise or drawing attention. It was about knowing when to be quiet, when to hold your ground, and when to let your actions speak louder than words. As Sarah turned to walk toward the exit of the terminal, she felt a sense of peace. She knew that the world could be a tough place, but it was also full of opportunities for people like her to rise above the noise and make a difference. And from now on, Sarah would walk through the world a little taller, a little stronger, and always ready to speak up when it mattered most. Because sometimes, the quietest people in the room are the ones with the most power. And Sarah had learned that the quiet strength she carried within her was more than enough to face any challenge that came her way.